Hello, my name is Riley Fraser, and welcome to QEN News, your one stop for all things queer education, policy, and ethics. Tonight, a special presentation on gender in schools. Me and my colleagues will be presenting several topics regarding gender in terms of educational policy and ethics. Before we begin, though, I'd like to lay out some terms to clear up our discussion. First is sex, which is the biological sex identified at birth. This is not always the same as gender. Some important terms regarding gender are gender expression, which is how one expresses their own gender through things like clothing and hairstyle, and gender identity, which is how one views their own gender. Transgender, or trans, refers to an individual that identifies with a gender other than the one assigned to them at birth. This is sometimes used as an umbrella term that incorporates other terms, like gender nonconforming or gender fluid. Finally, sexual orientation refers to who a person is attracted to. Keep these terms and their separate definitions in mind for this discussion. To begin, a short discussion of statistics. Census data from Statistics Canada shows that about 0.33% of individuals 15 and older identify with a gender other than one assigned to them at birth. Notably, this number is much higher for millennials than Gen Xers or baby boomers, and even higher for Gen Zers, where about 0.79% identify with a gender other than the one assigned at birth. Statistics Canada notes that this is likely a result of more accepting social conditions, and if this trend continues, numbers for Gen Alpha may be even higher. This may not sound like much at first, but it is nearly 1 in 125, and given the amount of students that an educator will teach over the course of their career, that is significant. An important thing to consider with gender-diverse individuals is stigma. A medical study from White-Hutto et al. Found 3 types of stigma that affect transgender individuals. Structural stigma, which involves social norms and laws. Interpersonal stigma, which is stigma enacted between individuals or small groups. And individual stigma, the ways stigma is internalized. Structural stigma in particular is important to be aware of when discussing policy. Moving on, I would like to make a few points about pronouns and name usage. The Dechinta Gender Toolkit lays out terms like pronouns, the way one refers to themselves, which can include their names, titles, or labels like he, him, she, her, they, them, and many more. Misgendering, when one has a gender attributed to them that they do not identify with, such as through the use of incorrect pronouns. And dead naming, when one is referred to with a name they no longer identify with. They highlight the kinds of harm that actions like misgendering and dead naming can do, such as damaging one's mental health. On the other hand, a study from Russell et al. Linked chosen name usage of transgender individuals in multiple contexts, such as schools, to a decrease in notable risk factors for this community, like depression and suicidal ideation. Next, I would like to discuss some cases to help provide information on what it's like for queer identifying teachers. An article from Tompkins discusses the experiences of 4 queer identifying teachers who were new to their practice. Dennis, who identifies as gay, faced pushback on his recommendations for gender-neutral washrooms, which created feelings of frustration for him. He also mentions the frustration of seeing posters about LGBTQ+ inclusion in the teacher's lounge, but then not seeing these ideals carried forward in policy and practice. Craig, a man who identifies as gay, found himself in an environment that he found supportive, which helped him feel empowered to advocate for the needs of his students and to create inclusive spaces in the school. His experience notes the kind of empowering effect that supportive administration and policy can have for educators. He does note that the language in legislation about sexual minority discussion in the classroom was not ideal. Rose, who self-identifies as queer, found herself at many different schools as a substitute and experienced varying levels of support. In her experience, she found that when there was a lack of visible inclusivity of the LGBTQ+ community, or a lack of explicitly anti-discriminatory policy in a school board, she would be unsure of the ground she stood on. Kelsey self-identifies as gay and gender nonconforming. She does not identify as transgender, but does present and exist outside of gender norms as part of her identity. In her first teaching job, she found herself facing discrimination from administrative staff. She quit and found a new job in a new province in which she felt the administration was more accepting. She also noted the importance of allyship and creating visibly safe spaces for both students and teachers. These experiences bring forth some important ideas, such as the importance of being aware of individual school climate and policy when looking for jobs. It also raises questions about when a teacher's identity may be scrutinized. Will new legislation put queer teachers at risk? On the topic of new legislation, I will discuss a case study regarding legislation in Saskatchewan. Given the recent nature of some of these discussions in legislation, finding case studies can be difficult, but we found one that highlights some important issues. UR Pride Center for Sexuality and Gender Diversity v. Saskatchewan Education was a case made by a group granted public interest advocating for an interlocutory injunction, or a pause, on the implementation of the use of preferred first name and pronouns by students policy laid out in Saskatchewan's Education Amendment Act, also sometimes called the Parents' Bill of Rights, until a decision had been made on the constitutional challenge raised about the act. This act features many similar points as Alberta's Education Amendment Act regarding discussion of gender and sexuality in schools that will be discussed later. The courts ruled in favor of UR Pride Center for Sexuality and Gender Diversity, but Saskatchewan Education then won out on the constitutional challenge by invoking Section 33 of the Charter, also known as the Notwithstanding Clause. What questions does this raise about how this legislation is viewed? Does it say anything that the courts did rule in favor of the UR Pride Center for Sexuality and Gender Diversity, only for their efforts to be nullified by the invoking of Section 33? But for more discussion on the new legislation in Alberta specifically, and much, much more, I'd like to throw it over to Sam. What have you got for us, Sam?
Thanks, Riley, but before I talk about Bill 27, I'd rather talk about some cultural considerations. Many non-Western cultures have a more diverse set of genders than just a man and woman. For example, we have the two-spirit identity in Indigenous tribes in so-called Canada and the United States of America, the Hijra identity, which is an identity within the Hindu faith, and then the Sakrata, which is part of a Saklava identity, which is a group of Indigenous people in Madagascar. By restricting gender expression and identity and discussion of these topics in schools, it is inherently placing Western Judeo-Christian values as more deserving or superior to those other cultural ontologies. With that important note out of the way, we can talk about Bill 27 and the Educational Amendment Act in Alberta of 2024. Teaching materials is an important thing in teaching. Amendment 7, the following is added after Section 18, learning and teaching resources are gender identity, sexual orientation, or human sexuality. A board shall not use or permit the use or provision of learning and teaching resources that deal primarily and explicitly with gender identity, sexual orientation, or human sexuality, unless the learning and teaching resources are approved by the minister. But this brings into question, what is approved by the minister for teaching? According to Learn Alberta, gender identity has 0 pre-approved resources, while sexual orientation has 3 pre-approved resources for students' access. However, only 2 of these are available to students with disabilities, and 4 available for teachers' use only. Human sexuality, on the other hand, has 0 available for students' use and 4 available for teachers' use. This calls into question, why are there so few pre-approved, and why are there certain resources that only teachers have access to? Mandatory reporting. According to Amendment 9, responsibilities, RE, parental notification, and consent for preferred name and pronouns. In this section, new preferred name and pronouns means a name or pronouns that A, vary from the name or pronouns that teachers, teacher leaders, or other school staff have regularly used when referring to the student, and B, the student prefers for reasons related to the student's gender identity. 2. Subject to subsection 4, if a student requests a new preferred name or pronouns to a teacher, teacher leader, or other school staff when referring to the student in school, the school board shall A, in the case of a student who is under 16 years of age, 1. Notify the student's parent of the request, and 2. Seek the parent's consent for teachers, teacher leaders, and other school staff to use the new preferred name or pronouns when referring to the student in school. Or B, in the case of a student who is 16 or 17 years of age, notify the student's parents of the request. 3. A teacher, teacher leader, or school staff member shall not use a new name or pronoun when referring to a student in school unless the parents are notified under Section B or consent is given under Section A. 4. Where A, notifying the student's parents or seeking parental consent, is reasonably expected to cause emotional or psychological harm to the student, or B, the student requests access to assistance, the board shall ensure that the student is provided with counseling or other assistance before notifying the student's parents. As mandatory reporters, it is our responsibility to help prevent abuse. By forcibly outing these trans students to their families, we are going to be contributing to abuse. Also, the lack of physical violence mentioned in Section 4 is appalling. Consent to instruction. Amendment 12. Notice and consent are gender identity, sexual orientation, or human sexuality instruction. 58.11.1. A board shall, in accordance with the policies established under Section 58.12, provide notice to and seek the consent of a parent of a student where courses, programs of study, or instructional materials, or instruction or exercises includes subject matter that deals primarily and explicitly with gender identity, sexual orientation, or human sexuality. 2. A board shall provide notice to the parent of a student at least 30 days before the start of a course, program of study, or instruction, or the first use of instructional materials or an exercise referred to in subsection 1. No board or teacher shall permit a student to take part in a course, program of study, or instructional or use instructional materials or an exercise referred to in subsection 1 unless the parent of the student has, before the start of the course, consented. This bill brings into question the priorities of our provincial government. We are the lowest funded educational program in the country, with educational expenditures being only $11,601 per student, according to Statistics Canada. Instead of focusing on bolstering our education system, hiring more teachers, increasing wages for support workers, they focus on appeasing far-right voters by using decades-old fear-monger tactics based on a misinterpretation of a religious text. Speaking of religious conservatism and far-right voters, there's a large trickle-down effect of policy to student behavior. A CBC News article talks about this in depth. A whole sermon just outside of Waterloo, Ontario in December 2023 was dedicated to the death by suicide of a transgender university student. This sermon was not held in good faith or remembrance, but in mocking tone. And I quote, "If you're going to live a lie to the point where you're willing to mutilate your own body, it's going to send you into dark despair." This sermon was held at Trinity Bible, a church that is very prominent in a fundamentalist movement on the rise in Canada that has been getting involved in electoral politics since 2020, advocating for conservative social and political-based policies based on the Bible. The group's goal is, as stated in a document obtained by CBC News, the most powerful political disruption in Canadian history. This group's name is Liberty Coalition Canada. This group has claimed to have gotten 110 municipal and school board members elected in Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and British Columbia. And of these candidates, many of them campaigned against efforts to deal with systemic racism and opposed teaching students about gender minorities. This group is contributing to the trickle-down of hateful lawmaking to hateful behavior in schools. And you can see this plainly on their website. For example, their GoFundMe for Josh Alexander. And I quote, "Josh Alexander was a grade 11 student at St. Joseph's High School in Renfrew, Ontario, until he was suspended, issued a trespass notice, and excluded for the entire remainder of the 2022 to 2023 school year by the principal of St. Joseph's, Derek Lennox. All because he expressed his Christian beliefs during class debates and on social media, that there are only two genders, that students cannot switch between genders, and that male students should not be permitted into girls' washrooms." St. Joseph's is a public Catholic school, part of the Renfrew County Catholic District School Board. Kicking Josh out of school and having him arrested for expressing his Christian beliefs is, among other things, unlawful religious discrimination. Liberty Coalition Canada also has their mission statement fully available on their website. And I quote, Liberty Coalition Canada was founded by several clergies in January 2021 as a formalization of activity to externalize and assert the ideas presented in the Niagara Declaration, which was drafted by Joe Boot, Aaron Rock, Michael Thiessen, and Andre Schutem. LCC quickly became a national movement with representatives joining from all over Canada. Liberty Coalition Canada exists for three main reasons. 1. We provide Canadians with a Christian conservative worldview of culture, law, and politics by proclaiming the rule and reign of Christ over the nations and calling people to turn to Christ in faith for the forgiveness of sin. 2. We defend Canadians who are being discriminated against for their religious and conscious beliefs. And 3. We engage in social advocacy to help transform our country to better reflect biblical principles. These religious beliefs being pushed into policy and the rise in far-right Christian beliefs are not coincidental. Neither are the parallels to the argument against gender identity, to the arguments against racial integration in schools that were prevalent in Canada during the 80s, when the last segregated school closed in Nova Scotia in 1983, and the anti-gay arguments made throughout the Western world in the 1980s. But giving us more context on where gender is missing in policy is Amanda Mathias.
Thank you, Sam. I'm Amanda Mathias, and continuing our story on gender in schools, where is gender missing? Both the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms and the Canadian Human Rights Act protect from discrimination based on sex, but neither include rights according to gender identity and expression. However, the Alberta Human Rights Act specifically mentions gender, stating that all persons are equal in dignity, rights, and responsibilities without regard to gender, gender identity, and gender expression, and encourage inclusive environments, equal opportunities, and research, development, and conducting educational programs designed to eliminate discriminatory practices. The Declaration of Rights and Responsibilities for Teachers declares that educators have the responsibility to refrain from practicing forms of discrimination, including gender, gender identity, gender expression, in their professional duties. So, folks, the information is there. The Alberta Human Rights Act and Declaration of Rights and Responsibilities for Teachers show that there is no room for discrimination based on gender in schools. Regardless of this, as my colleagues have demonstrated, Alberta has still introduced the Education Amendment Act of 2024. Let's take a look at how this relates to Sterrett's ethical lens. Human dignity, empowerment, individuality, loyalty, quality of life, cultural enrichment, and environment. What do all of these words have in common? They're all a part of standard of care, an approach that many educators take, but how are they expected to encourage these when the government enforces the Education Amendment Act? Reporting preferences for gender identity to parents removes students' autonomy, which can impact all aspects of standard of care. Think of how knowing their parents being told may stop a student from informing their teachers what they identify as, and how can a teacher create a welcoming and safe environment without openly being able to address diversity or have materials related to it without the Minister of Education's consent? What does ignoring a student's wishes and referring to them with a pronoun they do not identify as, because their parents have not consented, do for the dignity, empowerment, individuality, and quality of life of the child? What does it do to the sense of loyalty they feel to educators and or their comfort within the classroom and school? Educators who prefer the standard of critique lens associate with understandings of definitions, power, privilege, hierarchy, culture of silence, and domination. They may recognize that by the Alberta government ruling that learning and teaching resources that relate to gender identity, sexual orientation must be approved by the Minister of Education, or allowing to parents to opt in where course, programs of study, or instructional materials, instruction, or exercises include subject matter that deals primarily and explicitly with gender identity and sexual orientation. They are prioritizing a narrow point of view as the dominant one in our education system. The Alberta government is asserting that we are not able to represent gender identities and sexual orientations that do not fit cisgender heterosexual standards, perpetuating that all other ways of being are not normal or that they do not fit the status quo. Stats indicate that there will be students who either come from homes who have people with different gender identities or sexual orientations, and or the students themselves can be part of these groups. Studies show that representation of these backgrounds matter in the classroom as it fosters students' belonging and community, not just for those students who experiences align with this, but also those who do not have a relationship to the LGBTQ+ community, as it gives them an understanding of others' worldviews. Researchers say that topics surrounding gender and sexuality can be appropriately approached from a young age through books, allowing students to see diversity and representation, which attends to the standard of care and critique. Let's take a break from stare it to focus on the positive for a moment. As we've discussed, the case law for gender issues has not been tried often in Canada and the US. Regarding bathrooms, the law has been in favor of students having the right to use whichever washroom they feel best suits their gender identity, which is also the recommendation of researchers of this topic. Denial of access to bathrooms based on gender identity has been found in multiple cases to be a form of discrimination, and schools and staff have a responsibility to be educated on gender matters. The Alberta Human Rights Act supports this and students' ability to use the change rooms or locker rooms of the gender they identify with. It is also what allows elementary and secondary school trans athletes to compete in sports teams that are their recognized gender. Let's revisit Starrett's ethical lens. The third approach an educator can take is ethics of justice. Participation, equal access, policy formation, and implementation, rights and responsibilities are all terms that relate to justice and aspects of gender in school. My colleagues have already discussed some of these, and I will be going into them as well. So, despite the Alberta Human Rights Act, the government of Alberta has passed Bill 29, the Fairness and Safety in Sports Act, which will require students to create athlete eligibility policies and identification for whether or not students meet these requirements, which can impact how schools currently form and implement policy. Complaints and concern about whether or not a student's fit eligibility must be acted upon and recorded. This opens up the possibility of transgender students being denied the ability to participate in schools and for them to be outed or removed from teams based on their gender identity. The proposal also supports creating teams specifically for trans students. So there will be biological male teams, biological female teams, and then trans teams. These could create issues of students with different gender identities viewing themselves as other and not allowing access to sport for them. It is also discrimination based on gender identity, opposing Alberta Human Rights Act. Let's turn to Gabby for more information on extracurricular activities.
All right, thank you, Amanda. So, lastly, I am going to be talking about extracurriculars in the face of social isolation, social and emotional circles, and student groups. So, generally speaking, students are encouraged to participate in extracurricular activities that their school or institution has to offer for the benefit of expanding their social circles, learning new skills, and expanding on a creative outlet. Under EPSB's administrative regulation document, with the topic of the regulation being sexual orientation and gender identity, the regulation claims to advocate for a caring, respectful, and safe working environment that staff respects and should respect diversity and foster a sense of belonging for everyone. This includes all sexual minority staff, students, and families. The document specifically talks about establishment of a voluntary student organization and activity, meaning that if one or more students attending a school operated by the district requests a staff member for support to establish a voluntary student organization or to lead an activity intended to promote a welcoming, caring, respectful, and safe learning environment that respects diversity and fosters a sense of belonging. Another point that I thought would be really important to touch on would be, if no responsible adult can be found, the district shall inform the Minister of Education, who shall appoint a responsible adult to work with the requesting students in organizing the activity or to facilitate the establishment and ongoing operation of the student organization at the school. An example of this can be the gay straight alliances or queer straight alliances in schools. I'll delve into that a little bit later into this presentation or into this section. And lastly, the principal shall immediately inform their assistant superintendent if no staff member is available to serve as a staff liaison. The assistant superintendent, working on collaboration with the director of diversity, inclusion, or diversity education and comprehensive school health, shall assist the principal in appointing a responsible adult from the school community to work with the requesting students in organizing the activity or to facilitate the establishment and the ongoing operation of the student organization in schools. So let's take a closer look at the GSA and QSA, or GSAs and QSAs. So page 17 of the 2018 Teacher's Guide for GSAs and QSAs Handbook specifically describes GSAs and QSAs as the following important points. So some that I thought would be really important to point out were GSAs and QSAs student-run and teacher-supported school-based groups to create a welcoming and safe space for sexual and gender minorities and their allies in schools. They are made to foster a sense of belonging. Number 2, GSAs and QSAs are to meet, socialize, support, and connect with peers as they discuss their feelings and experiences related to sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. Number 3, GSAs and QSAs are a confidential space where no assumptions are made about anyone's gender identity or sexual orientation. Moreover, parental consent is not required to participate in GSAs or QSAs, and outing students can actually put them at great risk. This guide was also published in 2018, as I mentioned before, and this was before the Education Amendment Act. Number 4, GSAs and QSAs are stated to be an effective way for students and teachers to educate themselves on human rights, equality, and diversity. And number 5, GSAs and QSAs are a good way for students to support or get the support they might not always receive at home. So to continue on with GSAs and QSAs in schools, let's look at some institutional barriers. So there have been a lot of pushback from teachers and peers, despite the claims for advocacy of GSAs and QSAs. So with that being said, in an article published by Dr. Andre and Grace, or in an article published by Dr. Andre, titled Sexual and Gender Minorities in Canadian Schools, high school students were interviewed to gauge their perspective regarding the lack of willingness to further self-educate on gender and sexual minorities in schools. One of the high school students was the president of the school's GSA. In the interview, he stated that, "I think having more education would be helpful because when people are undereducated, they don't like what they don't understand or what they don't perceive to be as normal. I think that having an education is a really big aspect. Incorporating LGBTQ plus case studies into courses would be really helpful." So to continue on that, another student that was interviewed mentioned, "I feel because teachers are directly interacting with and impacting queer youth, it should be part of training them on a PD day or something, just to take a crash course on understanding. I don't know if these things do happen or what the situation is with that. I just wish in general that people knew more about us and just the facts and less of the perceptions. I don't know specifically what would be available to them, though I do wish there was more information that was commonly known. Overall, I think our teachers are pretty supportive, some more than others, just because they're more educated on everything. And some really do try to learn with you, which is also very helpful. They want to tell you stuff that they don't know. And there's a lot of improvements that can be made and a lot more information that can also be shared. With more knowledge, there's less misunderstanding, there's less judgment, and everybody can just live together more peacefully and not be angry at each other or confused." going on to a little bit of research, there are two main components to really be aware of: belonging and authenticity. So, extracurriculars in higher education, in the context of students' sense of belonging and authenticity in higher education, states that a sense of belonging and authenticity is vital in various outcomes, including academic performance. So, while some students in university feel a sense of belonging in classroom settings, others experience discomfort in the sense that they lack supportive relationships and cannot embrace themselves as a result. A weaker sense of belonging can hinder academic performance and other outcomes, such that it underscores the need for stimulating the student's sense of belonging. The article also puts a heavy emphasis on students needing authenticity to thrive, such that students need the opportunity to express their authentic selves without renunciation, as well as feeling valued while doing so. The theoretical framework in this article suggests that a sense of belonging and authenticity can be conceptualized, respectively, as a need for relatedness and differentiation. The need for relatedness is a fundamental human need in the sense that it encompasses the desire for regular and emotionally satisfying interactions where there is an effective concern for each other's well-being. This entails self-expression, distinctiveness, and individuality. The theoretical framework in this article suggests that a sense of belonging and authenticity can be conceptualized, respectively, as a need for relatedness and differentiation. The need for relatedness is also a fundamental human need in the sense that it encompasses the desire for regular and emotionally satisfying interactions where there is an effective concern for each other's well-being. This entails self-expression, distinctiveness, and individuality. So, existing research includes the two important needs for belongingness and readiness. These two needs resemble those that are part of the optimal distinctiveness theory, OPT to abbreviate it. So, this theory suggests that individuals in a group face two opposing needs: assimilation and differentiation. Assimilation, in the context of this theory, resembles the need for validation and similarity to others. For example, the need for relatedness involves the desire to feel connected to others and corresponds to belonging in the face of assimilation as part of ODT. Furthermore, this also encompasses the need for autonomy, which can be task-related, as in what one is allowed to do, or identity-related, as in who one is allowed to be. Differentiation resembles the need for uniqueness and individuality. Something that it's also really important to note is that ODT, or optimal distinctiveness, is achieved when these needs are balanced, and thereby social identity can be viewed as a compromise between assimilation and differentiation from others. So, just to conclude the last little bit of research, higher education research and development in the context of LGBTQ+ early career higher education staff from the Learning Policy and Practice for Supporting LGBTQ Students article suggests that the ongoing discrimination and marginalization faced by LGBTQ+ individuals in society as a whole has been facilitating academic freedom and expression and is a contributing factor in encouraging authenticity. Research has shown that LGBTQ+ individuals in academia face particular challenges related to their identity, major ones being a lack of support networks and exclusion to opportunities for progression due to the lack of representation. So the article lastly also highlights that queer staff adopt strategies of passing, covering, and being explicitly out. So this is a strategy of pretending to be heterosexual, and covering involves self-censorship to prevent others from identifying them as queer as well.